after my wife died. I thought my life was over. The house felt empty, silent, like a prison made of memories. Every corner, every photograph, reminded me of her. I had spent 60 years living, loving, working. And in an instant, everything I knew felt shattered. My name is Michael, I'm 56, and I never imagined that after my wife passed away, I would face a betrayal so sharp, so unexpected, that it would make me question every single relationship in my life. Before I go any further, I want to ask you to do something small that means the world to me. Subscribe to my channel if you enjoy real-life emotional stories. Leave a comment telling me the city or country you're watching from, and if you've ever experienced something similar in your family, share it, because maybe it will help someone else feel less alone. Now, let me tell you what happened. My stepson, Ethan, had been part of our lives for many years. When my wife and I married, I promised myself that I would treat him like my own. I would give him guidance, teach him responsibility, and love him as if he were my flesh and blood. For years I did. I watched him graduate, helped him with his career, lent him money when he needed it, and gave him advice on business decisions. I thought we had a bond, a trust that would last forever. But grief changes everything. And sometimes, grief uncovers truths you never wanted to see. 7 days after my wife passed, Ethan called me into the living room. His face was calm, but his eyes, there was something cold I had never seen before. "I've been thinking about the future of the company," he said. My company. The business I had built from the ground up, the business I had poured my life into. I don't understand," I stammered. "I'm taking over as CEO," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of joke. "This isn't a game. I've run this company for decades. You know that. I know, and I respect everything you've done. But it's time for new leadership. I've been planning this for a while. Effective immediately, I am the CEO." Something inside me froze. I didn't even have time to react before the words hit me like a hammer. You're firing me?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Yes," he said flatly. 7 days after the funeral, your tenure here is over. We'll handle the legal formalities, of course. But you won't be coming back to the office." I felt my chest tighten. My hands shook. This couldn't be happening. Not to me. Not after everything I'd done. For the next hour, I sat in that cold, quiet living room, listening to him explain logistics, salaries, and HR details. It was surreal. It wasn't just the loss of the company, it was the loss of my dignity, my sense of purpose, my identity. I had spent decades working, building, sacrificing, and suddenly, it all belonged to someone else. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to throw something across the room. But I didn't. I sat there, silent, trying to make sense of what had happened. And then, like a slow, creeping shadow, the realization hit me. Ethan had waited for my wife to die. He had waited for the perfect moment, when I was grieving, vulnerable, and alone, to make his move. Every smile, every polite conversation over the years, suddenly felt hollow. Every bit of trust one had placed in him, shattered. That night, I walked through the empty halls of our house, touching the walls my wife had loved, the furniture we had chosen together, the photographs that now seemed to mock me. And I realized, this wasn't just about a job. This was about betrayal. Family betrayal. Something so intimate, so personal, that it cut deeper than any business loss could. The next morning, I tried to reach him. I sent texts. I called. I left messages on his voicemail. Nothing. Not a single word. It was as if I had never existed in his world. I turned to old friends, the ones who knew both my wife and me. They listened, shocked, horrified, but no one could undo what had been done. The world kept turning. The sun rose and set. And I was left alone, in a house that felt colder than any office ever could. Days passed. I went through the motions of life. Eating, sleeping, taking walks, but my mind was consumed with one question: why? Why would he do this? Why would he wait for the moment I was most vulnerable? Why betray the one person who had welcomed him into a family, who had treated him as his own son? And then, slowly, I began to notice little things. Small inconsistencies. Subtle lies that I had overlooked for years. Conversations that didn't quite add up. Emails that seemed too carefully worded. And the more I looked, the more I realized. Ethan wasn't the man I thought he was. He was something else entirely. Something I had never seen before. Something I wasn't sure I wanted to see. I started keeping a journal again, something I hadn't done since my wife was alive. I wrote down every interaction, every suspicious detail, every moment that didn't feel right. It became an obsession, but it was the only way I could make sense of the chaos. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't confront him. I just watched, quietly, as he continued to act like the dutiful stepson in public, while behind closed doors, everything he had planned unfolded perfectly. And that's when I realized the first twist I hadn't anticipated. The betrayal was only the beginning. There were secrets my wife had kept from me. Documents, letters, maybe even a will that I had never fully understood. And Ethan. I wasn't sure if he knew everything, or if he had planned to uncover them after he took control. This story isn't just about losing a company or being betrayed by a family member. It's about realizing that sometimes, the people you trust the most are the ones capable of the most harm. And that grief blinds you to motives you never imagined. For the first time in my life, I felt powerless. Completely powerless. And yet, I couldn't stop watching, couldn't stop listening, couldn't stop piecing together the puzzle of a man I thought I knew, but clearly didn't. By the end of that first week, I had begun to accept one harsh truth: the life I had built, the family I had trusted, the love I had given, none of it guaranteed loyalty. None of it guaranteed honesty. And somewhere deep down, I wondered if my wife had known. Every morning, I woke up expecting things to return to normal. But they never did. The silence in the house, the absence of her voice, the way Ethan moved through the rooms with a calculated calm, it was all too much. I spent hours in the study, staring at the papers and files I had built over decades. Every ledger, every contract, every document reminded me of what I had created, and what was slipping from my grasp. Ethan wasn't just taking over the company. He was rewriting the rules, carefully, quietly, in ways I couldn't fully see. It was like watching someone dismantle a house brick by brick, and not being allowed to lift a hand. I began noticing things I had overlooked before. Small gestures, subtle changes. The way he interacted with employees, polite but commanding. The way he responded to clients, confident, almost too confident. And the way he looked at me, it wasn't just disrespect. There was something deeper. Something that sent chills down my spine. He wasn't just ambitious. He was strategic. Calculating. I remember one afternoon, I was going through some old emails on my laptop, trying to gather a sense of control, when I noticed a thread I hadn't seen before. It was subtle, a few messages between Ethan and a financial advisor, dated months ago. Nothing illegal, nothing overtly suspicious. But the tone was precise, deliberate. He had been planning his takeover long before my wife's death. I felt a strange mixture of anger and disbelief. How could I have been so blind? How could I have trusted someone who was preparing to replace me while I thought he was learning, growing, becoming part of the family? That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house, touching objects she had loved, trying to find a trace of comfort. And then I found it. A small box, tucked away in the bottom drawer of her bedside table. Inside were letters, neatly stacked, some in her handwriting, others typed. I didn't know what I was expecting: advice, memories, perhaps even something mundane. But what I found was far more unsettling. One letter, in particular, caught my eye. She had addressed it to me, though it was written before she died. The words were loving, but there was an undertone of caution, almost a warning. She wrote about Ethan. About the ambitions she had glimpsed over the years. About the careful, calculated nature of his mind. About the way she had tried to guide him, to nurture him, to teach him ethics and respect. And then, a line that made my stomach drop. I hope he never forgets the lessons I tried to teach him. But I know life doesn't always go the way we plan. That line, it felt like a warning. A premonition. And now, as I read it, I realized just how accurate it had been. I began to piece together what had happened. Ethan hadn't acted on impulse. He hadn't taken advantage of grief in the moment. He had been preparing, strategizing, waiting for the perfect opportunity. And when that opportunity came, he moved. Swiftly. Efficiently. Without hesitation. I couldn't believe it. My own stepson. The boy I had watched grow up, the one I had tried to love and guide. Capable of such cold calculation. Over the next few days, I observed him closely. Every interaction, every conversation, every subtle glance. He was careful, meticulous, always maintaining a facade of politeness. But behind that calm exterior, I could sense the ambition, the drive, the quiet ruthlessness. It wasn't just about the company. It was about control, power, dominance. And yet, there was something else. Something I couldn't quite place. Occasionally, I would catch him hesitating. A flicker of uncertainty, a shadow of doubt. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I wondered what he was thinking. Did he feel guilt? Regret? Or was it something else entirely, something darker, something I wasn't ready to face? One evening, I decided to take a walk. The cool air helped clear my mind, if only slightly. I wandered through the streets I had walked with my wife, the memories of laughter and conversation filling my head. And as I walked, I realized something important. I needed to accept the reality of the situation. Ethan was in control now. I had no power to change that. But what I could do was understand. Observe. Learn. Prepare myself for whatever came next. I began going through her belongings more systematically. There were other letters, documents, notes tucked away in books and drawers. Each one revealed pieces of her life, her thoughts, her hopes. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. She had known, or at least suspected, that Ethan might act in ways that were unexpected. She had tried to leave me guidance, subtle hints, clues that I had overlooked in my grief and trust. One particular folder contained financial statements, correspondence with lawyers, and notes about the company. I realized that she had been keeping tabs on Ethan's growth within the business, trying to anticipate how he might handle responsibility. It was like discovering a map of a journey I hadn't realized I was on. And the more I read, the more I understood that Ethan's actions, while shocking and hurtful, were part of a larger story. A story that my wife had seen unfolding long before I had. I also began noticing changes in the people around me. Employees who had once been friendly, loyal, and supportive now seemed distant. Conversations that used to be warm and collaborative were now cautious, measured, and polite. The atmosphere at the company, even through rumors and phone calls, felt tense. It was as if everyone had sensed the shift, had recognized the new power dynamics, and had adjusted their behavior accordingly. I couldn't help but feel a pang of isolation. I was no longer the center of this world I had built. I was an observer, a bystander, watching the life I had devoted myself to slip through my fingers. Yet, despite the sense of loss, there was a strange clarity. I could see things I hadn't seen before. Patterns, motives, strategies. I began to piece together not just Ethan's plan, but the way he moved, the way he manipulated, the way he positioned himself. And then came the moment that changed everything. One afternoon, I received a call from a longtime business associate, someone I trusted implicitly. He spoke cautiously, as if weighing every word. "You need to be careful," he said. "Ethan, he's not the man you think he is. He's smart, strategic. And he's planning something bigger than you realize. My heart pounded. I asked him to explain, to give me details, but he could only offer fragments. Hints. Suggestions. He wouldn't, or couldn't, go further. It was enough to confirm what I had begun to suspect. Ethan's ambitions extended beyond what I had imagined. And now, I was trapped in a web I hadn't anticipated, a web that my wife had hinted at but never fully revealed. That night, I sat alone, thinking, reflecting, and trying to make sense of everything. Ethan had taken control. He had outmaneuvered me. And yet, there were still mysteries, still unanswered questions, still hidden truths waiting to be discovered. The story was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was only just beginning. I realized that the real challenge wasn't just understanding Ethan's actions. It was uncovering the full truth behind my wife's hints, her letters, the subtle clues she had left behind. And so, I began the painstaking process of retracing her steps, piecing together fragments of conversations, documents, and memories. Every discovery brought new insights, but also new questions. It became clear that Ethan's betrayal was part of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that involved not just business, but family, trust, and the legacy my wife and I had built together. Every day, I learned more. Every day, I noticed more. And every day, the sense of betrayal deepened, but so did my determination to understand, to uncover the hidden truths, and to make sense of the life that had been turned upside down in just 7 days. I moved through my home, the rooms filled with memories, yet the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. Every photograph, every trinket, every corner whispered reminders of a life that felt stolen. 7 days. 7 days was all it had taken for Ethan to rewrite the rules of my existence. I realized something important. Grief had blinded me, but observation couldn't. I had to watch him closely, pay attention to every subtle movement, every choice he made. And Ethan, he was meticulous. He would schedule meetings with employees in a calm, polite tone, yet the authority in his voice was undeniable. He would call clients and partners, always projecting confidence, always one step ahead. It was clear he wasn't just filling my position, he was redesigning the company in his own image. I couldn't help but notice a pattern. The way he removed certain people from decision-making, the way he highlighted others, the strategic timing of every action. It was a chess game, and I was just watching, unable to interfere. But then, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, just my name in neat handwriting. Inside was a folder, filled with notes, financial statements, and old memos from my wife. As I flipped through the papers, I realized she had been documenting Ethan's rise, his behavior, and even subtle manipulations I had overlooked. She had left warnings, guidance, almost like she knew I would need them after she was gone. One note caught my eye. Ethan is capable of brilliance and coldness. Do not underestimate either. I felt a chill. I had underestimated him. I had assumed loyalty, assumed love, assumed gratitude. And I had been wrong. I began to cross-reference the documents with emails, files, and conversations. Patterns emerged. Ethan had been planning this for months, even years. Every helpful suggestion, every friendly advice session, every piece of guidance I had offered him, he had absorbed it, learned from it, and then used it to prepare for this moment. The betrayal cut deeper because it wasn't just ambition, it was premeditated. Every action calculated. Every word rehearsed. I started to realize that the house, the company, my life, everything, had been part of his preparation. And now, I was witnessing the outcome. Yet, amid the anger and disbelief, I found something strange. Occasionally, I noticed cracks in his composure. Brief moments when he hesitated, moments where I glimpsed uncertainty or doubt. They were fleeting, almost imperceptible, but they were there. I wondered, did he feel guilt? Did he care? Or was it something else entirely, a human flaw hidden beneath the precision? I decided to observe more carefully, to pay attention to the patterns, the routines, the small behaviors that revealed the man behind the mask. That evening, I walked through the company lobby, now under Ethan's control. Employees greeted him politely, their eyes cautious. Conversations were measured, respectful, almost mechanical. It was clear they had sensed the shift in power, and everyone was adjusting their behavior accordingly. I felt isolated, watching from the sidelines. The world I had built was no longer mine. The people I had trusted, nurtured, and guided were now under his influence. And yet, there was clarity in observation. I began documenting everything. Every interaction, every subtle gesture, every moment of control or hesitation. I needed a map of his mind, a blueprint of his motives. Then came a discovery that shook me more than I expected. While reviewing some old financial records, I found discrepancies. Small, almost imperceptible differences in how certain funds were allocated, how contracts were signed, how decisions were made. Nothing illegal, nothing criminal, but strategic, deliberate, designed to consolidate power quietly, without drawing attention. Ethan was not reckless. He was precise. Calculated. And he had been preparing for this moment long before my wife passed. I felt anger, yes, but also awe in a way. The level of foresight, the meticulous planning, it was unnerving. Then, one night, I found a letter tucked away in her desk, hidden beneath other papers. My wife had written it to me years ago, a reflection, a warning. Sometimes the ones we love most are capable of betrayal. Not out of hatred, but ambition. Be prepared, my love. Observe, understand, but do not confront without certainty. Her words resonated deeply. I realized I had approached life too naively, trusting too easily, believing too strongly. And now, the lesson was painfully clear. The next morning, I noticed Ethan reviewing a strategic report. His concentration was intense, his posture perfect, every movement deliberate. He paused briefly, as if considering something. And in that brief pause, I caught a flicker of hesitation. I wondered what he was thinking. Was he confident in every decision? Or was he navigating uncertainties I couldn't see? Days passed, and the tension grew. I became more vigilant, more analytical. I started noticing how he interacted with other executives, the subtle power plays, the quiet manipulation. It was like watching a master at work, yet the stakes were personal, intimate, and cruel. Then came the first true shock. One afternoon, an old friend from the company called me. He spoke cautiously, almost in whispers. "Michael, you need to be careful. Ethan, he's planning something bigger than you realize. I've seen glimpses. I can't explain everything, but trust me, it's strategic. Calculated. And it's personal." My heart raced. I tried to ask questions, but he ended the call abruptly, leaving me with fragments, pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I was ready to see. It was clear now that Ethan's ambition extended beyond just taking over the company. There was a deeper game at play, one I had not anticipated. That evening, I sat alone in my study, the papers and letters spread before me. Every note from my wife, every document, every observation, it all pointed to one truth: Ethan's actions were deliberate, premeditated, and part of a larger plan. And yet, even in the midst of betrayal, confusion, and hurt, I began to understand one thing clearly: knowledge was power. Observation was power. And if I wanted to make sense of this, I had to remain patient, quiet, and vigilant. I realized that the days ahead would test me in ways I had never imagined. Not physically, but emotionally, mentally, and morally. Ethan had taken my role, my company, my life's work, but he had not yet taken my understanding. Not yet. And in that understanding lay the potential to see the full truth, to uncover the secrets my wife had left, the motives behind Ethan's betrayal, and perhaps, the hidden paths that could change everything. The story was far from over. In fact, the deeper I looked, the more I realized that what had begun as a simple betrayal was only the tip of the iceberg. And I knew, without a doubt, that the coming days would reveal more than I could have imagined, if I was patient enough to watch and wait. I had become a ghost in my own home. Every corner reminded me of her, every photograph whispered memories I couldn't touch anymore. And yet I kept observing. Watching Ethan. Watching how he moved, how he controlled, how he planned. It was during one of these silent observations that I began to notice something I hadn't before. Ethan wasn't just ambitious, he was strategic in the extreme. Every action, every decision, every gesture was calculated. He had studied the company, our family, and even me in ways I hadn't imagined. And the more I watched, the more I realized, he wasn't just taking over my business. He was taking over my life, piece by piece. Then came the first real shock. I was going through some of my wife's old papers, letters, notes, and journals she had kept over the years, when I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a folder labeled simply, "For Michael, if I am gone." Inside, there were documents, financial records, and notes. Some of it I recognized, but others were revelations I had never known. She had documented Ethan's behavior for years. Every instance of ambition, every subtle lie, every manipulation had been noted. And there were warnings, clear as day, that Ethan was capable of betrayal. Not out of malice, she wrote, but out of calculated self-interest. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The man I had raised, guided, tried to love as my own, had been quietly planning this, while I had been blind, trusting, naive. But there was more. She had also left clues about a hidden contingency, an inheritance, a trust, a set of documents that Ethan might not even be aware existed. Something that could change everything if discovered. And that's when the fear hit me, not of losing the company, not even of Ethan's betrayal, but of what might happen if he found those documents first. I began to watch him even more closely. Every phone call, every meeting, every conversation with our associates, I noted it all. Ethan was careful, but he was not infallible. There were small slips, moments where his confidence faltered, moments where his ambition showed cracks. I started connecting dots I had overlooked for years. Old conversations, old decisions, subtle hints in emails and letters. Suddenly, a picture began to emerge. Ethan's plan was not just about taking control of the company. It was about consolidating power over the entire family, over every asset, every influence my wife and I had built. And then came the confrontation I had dreaded but expected. It was late in the evening. Ethan had stayed back at the office longer than usual. I had gone there quietly, under the pretext of reviewing some paperwork, but really, I just wanted to see him, to read his expressions, to understand the man he had become. When I entered, he looked up, startled for just a moment. But then his expression smoothed into polite calm. "Michael," he said, "I didn't expect you here. I wanted to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "About the company, about everything." He nodded, gesturing for me to sit. And as I did, I realized something horrifying. He knew more than I had imagined. His questions, his observations, even his tone suggested he had anticipated my reactions. We spoke for hours. On the surface, it was polite, strategic, controlled. But beneath that surface, there was tension, an unspoken war of wills. He didn't reveal his full intentions, but I could feel them. Ambition. Desire for control. A cold calculation that chilled me to the bone. And then came the twist I hadn't expected. During the conversation, he mentioned my wife. Not with sentiment, not with grief, but almost casually. As if he had analyzed her, understood her influence, and planned accordingly. "I always respected her vision," he said. "I just want to ensure her legacy continues. In the best way possible." It sounded sincere at first, almost comforting. But the more I listened, the more I realized it was manipulation. He was weaving a narrative to justify his actions, to make me doubt my anger, to control the emotional landscape as much as the business. I left that night shaken. Not just by betrayal, but by realization. I was dealing with a man who had been thinking 10 steps ahead for years. A man who had planned, observed, and executed without remorse. Back at home, I began digging deeper into my wife's notes and letters. There were more revelations. She had foreseen potential conflicts, she had documented financial strategies, legal options, and even subtle tests to gauge Ethan's integrity. And suddenly, I understood. Her letters were not just warnings, they were a map, a way for me to navigate the storm she had sensed would come. I realized I had a choice. I could succumb to despair, allow Ethan to dominate entirely, or I could use her guidance, her clues, and my knowledge of him to play my own game. I began to plan. Quietly. Patiently. Observing every move Ethan made, every interaction, every decision. I noted patterns. I noted weaknesses. And slowly, I started to see openings. But then came the most shocking revelation of all. While reviewing old company files, I stumbled upon a confidential legal document I hadn't noticed before. It was part of a trust, a contingency plan my wife had quietly arranged. She had anticipated potential betrayal and had secured a mechanism to protect certain assets, ones that Ethan might assume were fully under his control. I felt a surge of hope. A path forward. A way to counterbalance his ambition. And yet I knew this wouldn't be easy. Ethan was cunning, intelligent, and ruthless. Any move I made would be watched, analyzed, and potentially countered. I had to be strategic, precise, and patient. The house, the company, my life, it was all a chessboard now. And Ethan, he was a formidable opponent. But for the first time since my wife's death, I felt a spark of determination. I wouldn't let betrayal define my remaining days. I wouldn't allow manipulation to dictate the outcome. I had insight, knowledge, and the guidance my wife had left behind. And if I played my cards right, I could turn the tables. But I also knew one thing: the next steps would be dangerous. Emotional, psychological, and potentially devastating. The game had begun in earnest, and neither of us would emerge unchanged. I spent nights poring over every detail: letters, financial records, personal notes. Every word, every gesture, every small hint from my wife became a piece of the puzzle. I began to anticipate Ethan's moves, to predict his strategies, to prepare for the inevitable confrontations. And somewhere deep down, I realized that revenge, if it ever came, wouldn't be impulsive or angry. It would be calculated, measured, and unstoppable. Ethan had taken the first move. But the game was far from over. And as I closed the folder that night, a sense of clarity washed over me. The story of betrayal, ambition, and family loyalty was reaching its peak. The next revelations, the next moves, would determine everything. Weeks had passed since Ethan had taken over the company, since I had discovered the hidden letters, the financial contingencies, and the subtle warnings my wife had left. Every day, every move, every glance felt like part of a game I hadn't signed up for. But now, I realized, it was one I had to play. I spent hours studying the documents she had left. Every note, every financial record, every observation about Ethan's behavior became a tool. And slowly, a plan began to form. Not out of anger, not out of impulse, but with precision, with patience, with purpose. Ethan thought he had won. He thought I was powerless, overwhelmed by grief, and incapable of countering his calculated moves. But he had underestimated me, and he had underestimated the foresight my wife had given me. One afternoon, I walked into the office under the guise of reviewing old paperwork. Ethan was there, as expected, confident, composed, seemingly untouchable. "Michael," he said, smiling slightly. "I didn't expect to see you today. I wanted to review some documents," I said casually, keeping my tone light, my demeanor calm. "I thought you might want a second set of eyes." He nodded, almost pleased. "Of course. Anything for the company. Anything to maintain her legacy." I smiled inwardly. That was it, the key. He believed he had control over her legacy. He believed he had manipulated every angle. And now, I had the power to shift the narrative. I took the documents I had found, the hidden trust, the contingencies my wife had arranged, and laid them on the desk. I found some old financial records, I said. Some things that were overlooked. Ethan leaned forward slightly, scanning the papers, but he didn't realize the significance. These weren't just financial statements. They were part of a plan my wife had built, a map to protect the family's legacy even in the face of betrayal. And then I started asking questions, not accusatory, not angry, but precise, thoughtful questions that forced him to reveal more than he intended. Each answer, each hesitation, each carefully measured word gave me insight into his true motives. It became clear that Ethan's ambition wasn't just about power over the company. It was about control over every aspect of the family's life, every asset, every influence, every legacy my wife and I had worked for decades to build. But he had overlooked one thing: foresight, patience, and observation. Over the next few days, I quietly executed the steps my wife had designed. I secured the documents, double-checked the legal implications, and prepared a subtle but irreversible countermeasure. It wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about balance, fairness, and exposing truth without confrontation. Then came the pivotal moment. Ethan called me into his office, confident, commanding. "Michael, I need your input on the new strategy," he said. "I want your perspective before finalizing everything." I agreed, taking a seat across from him. On the surface, it was business as usual. But beneath that, I was ready. Every move, every word, every gesture had been anticipated. I began subtly guiding the conversation, introducing the documents, pointing out financial and legal nuances that only someone with decades of experience, and the foresight of my wife's guidance, could recognize. He tried to maintain control, but I could see the cracks forming. Hesitation. Small slips. For the first time, his composure faltered. And then, without directly confronting him, I revealed the hidden contingency, the mechanism my wife had created to protect the family's interests, to balance power, and to expose any unethical manipulation. He froze. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. Confidence wavered. Ambition clashed with realization. And in that moment, I understood that the game had shifted. It wasn't anger that fueled me, it was clarity. Precision. The understanding that betrayal could be countered not with rage, but with foresight, strategy, and subtle revelation. I didn't shout, I didn't accuse. I simply presented the facts, the documents, and the legacy my wife had preserved. Each word, each revelation, slowly dismantled the illusion of control he had so carefully built. By the end of the meeting, Ethan sat back, silence heavy between us. The expression on his face was unreadable: shock, realization, maybe even respect. He had underestimated me, underestimated my wife's foresight, underestimated the bond of observation and understanding I had cultivated in her absence. In the days that followed, the company adjusted. Ethan had to recognize the limits of his authority. He realized that while he had ambition, he hadn't accounted for the protective measures my wife had put in place. And while he remained CEO in title, the balance had shifted subtly but irrevocably. The family's legacy, the assets, and the truth were secure, not through confrontation, not through revenge, but through calculated patience and understanding. At home, I finally felt a sense of peace. The betrayal, the grief, the uncertainty, it had all led to a new equilibrium. I understood Ethan for who he was, and I had preserved the life my wife had envisioned, the legacy she had fought to protect. And then, one quiet evening, I opened her letters again. Reading her words, I felt her presence, her wisdom, her love. She had foreseen the storm. She had left me the tools to navigate it. And she had trusted me to act with patience, intelligence, and dignity. Ethan never realized just how close he had come to losing everything. Not because of force, not because of anger, but because of foresight, patience, and the quiet power of knowledge. I didn't need to confront him with rage. I didn't need to humiliate him. The subtle truth, the hidden mechanisms, and the wisdom of my wife had spoken for themselves. And in that quiet resolution, I finally understood, betrayal doesn't have to destroy you. Sometimes, the right observation, the right patience, and the right plan can turn the tide without a single confrontation. The company, the family, the legacy, everything my wife and I had built, remained intact. And I had learned a lesson that grief, betrayal, and ambition could never erase. The power of patience, insight, and understanding is greater than any impulsive act of revenge. I looked around my home, quiet, peaceful, the memories of my wife alive in every corner. Ethan remained a part of the family, a part of the company, but the scales had shifted. Not through anger, not through confrontation, but through subtle strategy, insight, and the quiet guidance my wife had left behind. And in that, I found closure, not just for the betrayal, not just for the loss, but for the life I had lived, the love I had given, and the lessons I had learned along the way. Sometimes, the greatest victories aren't loud. They're quiet. They're subtle. And they're far more powerful than anyone can imagine. And so, the story ends. Not with vengeance, but with clarity, understanding, and the knowledge that the bonds we build, the foresight we carry, and the patience we practice are stronger than ambition, betrayal, or even grief itself.